Imagine sitting at a wooden table 600 years ago, staring down at a bowl of something you're not entirely sure is food. The rain has been falling for months. The fields are drowned, the cattle are gone. And the bread, if there's any left, tastes of mold and bark. You're hungry enough that the sound of a rat scurrying across the floor doesn't disgust you anymore. It makes you think of dinner. Tonight, we're going back to the Middle Ages, to the forgotten years when hunger ruled Europe. When people boiled their shoes, ground up tree bark for bread, and roasted rats over open fires just to stay alive. It's not a story of kings or knights, but of ordinary people and the quiet, desperate ways they survived. So settle in. Let the candles flicker low. This is when rats were dinner, the forgotten foods of the Middle Ages. If you were to step into a medieval village on a gray morning in the early 14th century, the first thing you'd notice would not be the castles or the banners, but the smell. It would be a mixture of damp earth, smoke, and boiled cabbage, a scent that clung to everything and everyone. The idea of food, as we know it today, was very different then. Meals were not occasions of indulgence or variety. They were acts of endurance. To eat in the Middle Ages was to survive one mouthful at a time, in a world where hunger was as familiar as the changing of seasons. The Middle Ages were 1,000 years long, but famine was their quiet companion. Even in the years between great disasters, between wars and plagues, hunger visited regularly, especially in the north of Europe. Crops depended on the weather, and the weather could turn cruel without warning. A single cold summer could ruin a year's harvest. Heavy rain could drown the grain. Frost could destroy what little sprouted from the earth. And when that happened, there were no relief systems, no imports, no reserves from neighboring kingdoms. The roads were poor, the rivers slow, and food, once spoiled, stayed spoiled. The most terrible example of this came between 1315 and 1317, in what later chroniclers called the Great Famine. It began, as disasters often do, with rain. Not just any rain, but endless rain, falling week after week, until the ground became a swamp and the fields turned into shallow lakes. Seeds rotted before they could grow. Barley, oats, and wheat, the staples of the European diet, never ripened. The harvest failed once and then again, and the hunger that followed spread from village to village like a shadow. At first, the people were patient. Famine was not new. It had happened before. They ate less, stretching their stores of grain by mixing in peas or beans. They baked bread with more water, cut thinner slices, and told themselves that next year would be better. But when the next year came, the rains returned. The rivers overflowed. The roads became impassable. Cattle drowned in the fields, and those that survived had nothing to eat. Even the nobles' barns, once filled with wheat and barley, grew empty. When food ran short, creativity began. In England, chroniclers recorded that people made bread from whatever they could grind. Peasants in Germany and Norway stripped bark from birch and pine trees, dried it, and pounded it into powder. Mixed with a handful of flour, it made a gray, heavy loaf, bark bread, they called it, bitter and dense, but filling. Others dug for roots and bulbs, boiling thistles and nettles, eating whatever weeds could be found. In France, there were stories of people boiling old animal hides, scraping the softened leather to chew it like tough meat. In the towns where rats thrived in the grain stores and sewers, they too became food. It's difficult for us to imagine now. But to the people of the Middle Ages, the line between edible and inedible was not as clear as it is today. Hunger changed everything. Rats were not appetizing, but they were a source of meat, and meat meant calories. In some places, roasted rat became a market item. One record from Flanders notes that 2 rats sold for 3 pennies, written plainly in a merchant's ledger, as if it were no different than a note about a loaf of bread or a jug of ale. To modern readers, it sounds grotesque, but to those who lived through that hunger, it was just another transaction, one more attempt to fill an empty stomach. The Great Famine affected all levels of society, but its weight fell hardest on the poor. The rich had stores, servants, and grain houses, though even their supplies eventually dwindled. Peasants had little to begin with, a small patch of land, a few chickens, perhaps a pig or goat. When famine came, they sold what they had. First the animals, then the tools, and finally the land itself. By 1316, many villages had emptied. Families wandered the countryside, searching for food or shelter, their hunger visible in their faces. A chronicler in England described seeing men and women whose flesh clung to their bones, lying in the streets and in the fields, unable to rise from weakness. Monasteries were among the few places that offered relief. The monks, who lived by strict routines, kept records of their rations and of what they gave away. One abbot in Brabant wrote that his monastery distributed 7,000 loaves of bread in one season, though even that could not feed everyone. Outside the monastery gates, crowds of the hungry waited each morning, hoping for a piece of bread, a ladle of pottage, or a handful of grain. Many were turned away. Even charity had limits when the barns were bare. Hunger does strange things to the mind. It dulls and sharpens at once, dulling the sense of shame, sharpening the instinct to survive. There were stories, whispered and written down by monks, of people stealing from graves, of bodies being dug up for meat. Whether all these stories were true, no one can say, but the fear of them was real. In a time when death was everywhere, famine blurred the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. To eat at all, sometimes, meant breaking taboos older than memory. Even in towns less affected by famine, food was far from what we would recognize today. Medieval diets were limited by season and geography. In Northern Europe, winters were long and dark. Fresh vegetables were a luxury. Meat, when available, was heavily salted or smoked to preserve it. Fish was common, especially on church fast days, when meat was forbidden, but inland villages often relied on dried or pickled fish that could be transported overland. Salt, in those days, was precious. It was mined from deep pits or evaporated from seawater, and traded across great distances. Without it, preservation was nearly impossible. And so, in times of shortage, food not only ran out, it spoiled. Spoilage brought another danger, ergot. This toxic fungus grew on damp rye, especially during the long wet seasons of the famine years. Bread made from infected rye could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and even death. Villages struck by ergot poisoning often believed themselves cursed or possessed. The symptoms, burning limbs, delirium, fits, led to the name St. Anthony's fire. Whole communities suffered, their hunger and illness merging into one shared nightmare. But the story of the Middle Ages is not only one of starvation. It is also one of survival. People learned, adapted, and remembered. Out of necessity came a kind of quiet knowledge of wild herbs, of edible weeds, of ways to stretch a meal. The peasant woman at her hearth knew which leaves could be boiled to make a broth, which roots would ease the stomach, and which mushrooms were safe to eat. This knowledge was passed down not in books, but through hands and memory. To forget it was to risk death. In the towns, bakers and brewers also adapted. When grain was scarce, brewers used whatever they could find, oats, beans, even peas to make ale. It tasted sour and rough, but it was drinkable. Bakers used ground acorns and chestnuts to mix with flour. These substitutions changed the texture of bread, sometimes making it hard as stone. Still, people ate it. Hunger gave every crumb value. As the famine years dragged on, people began to question why. In a world shaped by religion, few believed that such suffering could happen without divine purpose. Priests preached that the famine was punishment for sin, for pride, for greed, for war. In many towns, processions were held to ask God for mercy. Relics of saints were carried through the rain, hymns were sung, and the people knelt in the mud to pray for dry skies. Some fasted intentionally, believing that humility would bring back the sun. It did not. The rains continued. There were practical measures too. Kings and councils attempted to regulate grain prices, forbidding merchants from hoarding or exporting food. But laws meant little when supply itself was gone. Merchants raised prices in secret. Nobles protected their own stores. The market became a place of tension. A handful of flour could be worth more than a day's wages. In cities, people rioted. Grain carts were attacked, warehouses looted. In Paris, crowds broke into bakeries, demanding bread at any price. Soldiers were sent to restore order, but they too were hungry. Discipline frayed. By 1317, the rains finally stopped. Slowly, the land began to dry and new crops were sown. But the famine had changed Europe. It had weakened populations, reduced livestock, and broken the confidence of kingdoms. Many who survived carried scars, physical and emotional. They spoke less of what they had eaten and more of what they had lost. For generations afterward, the famine lingered in memory as a warning. Even centuries later, in the 1500s, travelers in Northern Europe could hear old people mutter when food was scarce. It has been worse. Yet even after the Great Famine, hunger remained a part of life. Lesser shortages came and went with the seasons. Bad weather, war, or disease could still destroy a harvest. In these times, people returned to the same old methods, the same weeds, the same roots, the same small creatures. Rats never truly left the medieval diet. They were not a delicacy, but in port cities and river towns, where rats were numerous and plump, they were sometimes trapped and cooked. In London, they appeared in the markets occasionally, disguised among other small meats. In southern France, rat stew, ragout de rat, survived in folk memory long after the famine had passed. A relic of hard times when plague came in 1347. Carried by fleas on those same rats, the irony was bitter. The animal that had once fed the starving now brought them death. But the connection between rat and human had always been close. Both were survivors, adaptable, quick, able to live on scraps. For the average medieval person, meals were small and repetitive. Breakfast, if it existed at all, was a piece of coarse bread and some ale. The main meal came at midday, a pottage, a thick soup of grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available. In times of plenty, it might contain a bit of bacon or fish. In times of want, it was mostly broth and cabbage. Dinner, in the evening, was lighter still. Spices were rare, except among the wealthy, and even then they were used less for taste than for preservation. Pepper, cinnamon, and saffron were imported from faraway lands and cost more than gold. To eat well in the Middle Ages was to be part of a small and privileged class. For everyone else, food was a cycle of scarcity and improvisation. Even in good years, hunger hovered at the edge of memory. There was always the knowledge that another bad season could come, another rain, another frost, another blight. And so people learned to make do. They learned to store and to share, to trade favors and labor for meals, to turn the inedible into something, if not pleasant, at least possible. It's easy to look back and see the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance or misery, but that would miss something essential. The people who lived then were not naive. They were pragmatic. They understood the fragility of life in a way we rarely do now. To wake up each morning, to find something to eat, to keep a fire burning, these were victories. And out of those small victories came traditions, recipes, and habits that lasted for centuries. The pickled vegetables of Eastern Europe, the dried fish of Scandinavia, the fermented grains of rural England, all of them are echoes of a time when preservation was survival. Even the church fasts, so common in medieval life, had their practical side. By banning meat on certain days, the church unintentionally helped manage scarce resources, giving herds time to recover and reducing pressure on grain supplies. Religion and necessity intertwined in ways that made sense to those who lived them. Today, when we hear that medieval people ate rats or bark or boiled leather, it sounds barbaric. But if we look closer, what we find is not savagery, but adaptability. A world where people learned to bend rather than break. Where meals were humble, but each bite mattered. Where food was not a luxury, but a reminder of life's thin thread. There's something quietly profound in that. Imagine sitting in a small cottage in 1316, the roof dripping from the rain outside. A woman stirs a pot over a smoky fire. Inside, the pot are a few cabbage leaves, some ground peas, and a scrap of meat she bought at the market. Perhaps rat, though she doesn't say. Around her, children wait, sleepy and thin. The smell is earthy, bitter, but warm. When the food is ready, they eat slowly, in silence. There is no joy in it, but there is relief. The meal is not much, but it means another day. Those days built the centuries. The quiet persistence of people who refused to stop, who endured hunger and weather and the indifference of fate. They left behind no monuments, no great speeches, only the simple evidence of their survival. The recipes, the customs, the memory of strange foods that once kept them alive. And so, when we speak of weird foods of the Middle Ages, we are really speaking of resilience, of what people do when there is nothing left to do but live. We are speaking of 1,000 small acts of courage, performed not on battlefields or thrones, but in kitchens and fields. With empty stomachs and steady hands, the Middle Ages ended long ago, but the question they leave behind is one that still lingers quietly, almost uncomfortably, in the back of the mind. When the world offers you nothing, what would you call food? Where does survival end and civilization begin? Maybe the answer lies somewhere between the two, in the smoke of a poor woman's hearth, in a pot of boiling weeds, in the simple, enduring act of eating, whatever form that takes. If you're still here, thank you for listening. In a world that moves a little too fast, it means a lot that you chose to slow down and spend some quiet minutes with history tonight. If this story helped you drift off, or if you just enjoy these calm corners of the past, you can support quiet, boring sleep by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more sleepy historians find their way here, and it lets me keep making more stories like this one. Until next time, rest well, and may your dreams be peaceful, if not a little bit historical.